Hello everyone, and welcome in for some more human physiology. So in this video we are going to start looking at the reproductive system. Now we're not going to get into a whole bunch of crazy details about the reproductive system. This is meant to be a supplement to our discussions in chapter 17 on the endocrine system. So we're mostly just going to be focusing on the role that different hormones play in both the maintenance and maturation of the reproductive systems, and then also some of the other things involved in actual sexual reproduction. So basically we're just going to split this up into two different videos, one on the male reproductive system and one on the female reproductive system, and we're going to have some discussions on some of the hormones that are going to be important for each system. So let's go ahead and get into this. So, if you will recall back in some of our earlier discussions in our review of biology and things of that nature, we said that most cells in the human body are called somatic cells, and they are going to be diploid. So, diploid means that each one of those cells is going to have 2 copies of every chromosome. So, that's going to give us a total of 46 chromosomes per cell. So the deal here, though, is that because sexual reproduction involves the union of 2 cells, which is the fertilization process, we can't really have those cells that are joining together be diploid themselves. Otherwise, every new generation of new offspring and organisms would have twice as many chromosomes as the generation that came before it. So if each of our cells has 46 chromosomes, then the next generation would have 92 and then 184 and then so on and so forth from there. So we can't really have that. That's no way for a species of organism to function. So it's for that reason that our gametes, both sperm and egg, sperm in men and egg in women, because these are the cells that actually participate in the fertilization, in order to maintain 46 chromosomes per generation, these are going to be haploid cells, meaning that they only have 1 copy of every chromosome per gamete, and that's a total of 23 chromosomes. So if you have a sperm and an egg joined together during the fertilization process, that's 23 chromosomes plus 23 chromosomes, and that gets you back to 46. So it really works out perfectly there. So we've already seen back in chapter 17 when we were looking at some of these reproductive hormones in an extremely basic way, we've already seen how luteinizing hormone, which comes from the anterior pituitary, will stimulate the testes or the ovaries to make their respective sex hormones. And we mentioned very briefly that follicle-stimulating hormone will similarly stimulate gamete production in either, again, the testes or the ovaries, but we haven't really talked about any of these things in intense detail yet, so that is the purpose of this particular chapter here. So this our first video is going to really focus on the male reproductive system. Now, take it from me, the male reproductive system is much simpler than the female reproductive system, so it's going to really serve as a good launching point here for us in terms of getting an idea of how these things work. And then for reasons that we will discuss in the next video, the female reproductive system is just naturally a little bit more involved just because it's not just about forming gametes and secreting sex hormone, it's about also child rearing, dealing with all of the events that happen after fertilization. So naturally it's going to be more involved. So if we're looking at the male reproductive system, we're looking specifically at the testes. So each testis is going to be encased within a pair of serous membranes called the tunica vaginalis. So you can see a lot of different structures here in one of these testes, but the main structure that we really want to focus in on here without really paying too much attention to other details are the seminiferous tubules, everything that you're seeing here in kind of a light blue color. These seminiferous tubules are going to serve as the site of both sperm production and maturation, a process we call spermatogenesis. So in this picture that we're looking at here, we are seeing a cross-section of one of these seminiferous tubules. And within this cross-section, we can see a central lumen, meaning kind of a hollow portion of this tube in which we are going to find seminal fluid and any maturing sperm that have been released into that lumen. Now, surrounding here, you can see the nuclei of several cells here. So seeing the nuclei in this micrograph tells us that we're dealing with cells, right? So there are two different types of cells we really want to focus on here other than the maturing sperm themselves, and these are called Sertoli cells and Leydig cells. The Leydig cells, if we focus on these first, are not actually within the seminiferous tubule. They're actually sitting here on the outside, being maintained within the interstitial fluid, which is why they're also sometimes called interstitial cells. The Sertoli cells are actually within the wall of the seminiferous tubule themselves. So each one of these cells is going to serve a particular purpose here in terms of getting the spermatogenesis process going and maintaining it. So the Sertoli cells, which as we said are actually within the seminiferous tubule on the luminal side, meaning the side that is closest to the lumen, they are going to secrete paracrine signals. These are signals that obviously don't get into the bloodstream, otherwise we'd call them hormones. These paracrine signals are going to influence the progression of what are called germ cells through spermatogenesis. So these germ cells are called spermatogonia. So if you look up here in this diagram, as we make our way through the spermatogenesis process, these are actually diploid cells. So that may not make a whole lot of sense to you because we just got done saying each one of the sperm needs to be haploid, right? So what are we doing with a diploid cell here? So a number of different cell division processes here are going to happen during the spermatogenesis process that will eventually give us haploid sperm. So you need not worry about that. You need only kind of sit back and enjoy the ride and see how that is actually going to happen here. So the spermatogonia, the germ cells here, are going to undergo one round of mitosis here in order to generate two diploid primary spermatocytes. They will then enter into meiosis, which, if you'll recall from your general biology, is very much distinct from mitosis in that meiosis actually involves two nuclear divisions rather than one. So that's going to be how we go from diploid to haploid. So when these primary spermatocytes undergo meiosis, and since that involves two nuclear divisions, we will then produce the haploid secondary spermatocytes and then eventually the spermatids that are going to serve as the precursor to our final mature spermatozoa. So the spermatids have the correct number of chromosomes that we're looking for here. They have just one copy of each chromosome. They only now need to do a little bit of maturing, including the development of an acrosome, which we will talk about shortly, and then also the development of the microtubule-powered flagella that enable them to swim throughout bodily fluids in an effort to find the egg for the fertilization process. So this whole process here is, in addition to the paracrine signals coming from the Sertoli cells, it is ultimately promoted by follicle-stimulating hormone. FSH, which comes from the anterior pituitary, stimulates those Sertoli cells to release those paracrine signals we were mentioning. So the presence of follicle-stimulating hormone allows the spermatogenesis process to happen again and again and again. So let's take a look at one of these mature spermatozoa here. So there's a lot of different moving pieces here, and first thing you'll probably notice is that this doesn't look like any sort of cell that we've seen before. It is obviously highly specialized for the job that it is meant to do. So there are a couple of structures here that I want to draw your attention to, the first one being the acrosome. So you can see the nucleus up here around the head of the sperm. It is surrounded kind of in semicircle fashion by this acrosome. The acrosome is actually just a collection of lysosomes and lysosomal enzymes, and the reason why we want these lysosomes collecting around the head of the sperm is that during the fertilization process, the head of the sperm is going to encounter the egg, which is shielded by an impenetrable membrane called the zona pellucida. These lysosomes will fuse with the zona pellucida, and those lysosomal enzymes will start to dissolve and break down the zona pellucida, meaning the nucleus of the sperm can then get inside and begin the fertilization process. The second structure I want to draw your attention to here is the midpiece. The midpiece contains all of the microtubule motor proteins that power the flagellum, which is actually made up of microtubule fibers. The one thing I really want to draw your attention to here is that the midpiece boasts an impressive collection of mitochondria that are occupying the same space as the centrioles and those microtubule motor proteins. So if we consider this by looking at the picture, an important philosophical question to ask here is, why do you think the mitochondria are clustering around the base of that flagellum at the midpiece? So, give you a second to think about it, but the idea here is that since mitochondria's main job is to make ATP energy, it probably says something about the energy requirements of those motor proteins and the energy requirements of flapping around that flagellal tail. Okay, so let's talk about the other aspect of the male reproductive system, which is the production of the sex hormone testosterone. So this is going to be where the Leydig cells come into effect. So we already saw how the Sertoli cells are going to be by and large responsible for the spermatogenesis process and promoting it and keeping it going. So on the other hand, we're splitting up the labor here and having the Leydig cells be in charge of producing testosterone. So Sertoli cells for spermatogenesis, Leydig cells for making testosterone. So we already said that these Leydig cells are also called interstitial cells, and that is because they actually exist on the basolateral side of the epithelial cells that make up the seminiferous tubules. So they're technically in the interstitial fluid. They're actually not really a part of the seminiferous tubules per se, but we're just picking nits at that point. So if the Sertoli cells were responsive to follicle-stimulating hormone, the Leydig cells are going to be responsive to luteinizing hormone, which again also comes from the anterior pituitary. So one other thing that is worth mentioning, the Sertoli cells do also make a protein called androgen binding protein, which helps to solubilize the testosterone within the seminal fluid. So you'll recall that testosterone is a hydrophobic steroid hormone, so we kind of need to make a carrier protein to kind of lug it around within the aqueous seminal fluid. So just a couple of quick things to say about testosterone production. It will start occurring in a developing male about 7 weeks post-fertilization, so while the developing baby boy is still in his mother's uterus, and this will actually start stimulating the formation of male-specific anatomical characteristics. So if you dabble much in developmental biology, 7 weeks before, or in the 7 weeks leading up to this event, the developing embryo doesn't really have any particular physical characteristics that would give them away as a male or a female, but this surge of testosterone really kind of serves as the trigger for the actual differentiation of tissues to form the testes rather than kind of going to the default ovaries. So testosterone levels ultimately, though, stay pretty low in childhood, and then, as I'm sure you're aware, they really start to rise during puberty, which really starts to trigger the final developmental sexual characteristics in the developing male. So from here on out, there should be pretty consistent and strong production of testosterone throughout the rest of adulthood, and that's for good reason, because that testosterone is necessary for helping to maintain the male reproductive system throughout the rest of the life, and it allows the male to continue to produce sperm no matter how long they live. Okay, so that does it for the first video on the male reproductive system. I told you it was pretty simple, so we didn't really need to spend a whole lot of time on it. So in this chapter, we are actually going to spend the vast majority of our time talking about the female reproductive system for the reasons that I kind of already laid out. It just makes sense because the female is tasked with doing so much more than the male in the reproductive process. Everything's just going to have a little bit more into it in terms of moving pieces. So that does it for this video, and I hope you will join us next time, and we will start talking about the female reproductive system with a focus on the important hormones there. So join us next time, and I will see you then.